Richard O. Prum is a biologist, ornithologist, and Pulitzer Prize finalist whose new book, Performance All the Way Down, brings feminist thought directly into conversation with biology. Please join me in welcoming Richard O. Prum.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet readers and interested folks. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank the Town Hall here in Seattle, Third Place Books for supporting the work, James Kuhn and Aisha, and Claire Idstrom here at the Town Hall for helping to organize this. I'd like to start with a very short reading from the book in my prologue. In this book, I openly question whether certain foundational scientific categories, like male and female, have been defined in specific ways to preclude the results of their investigation, to prevent even the perception of their scientific shortcomings and weaknesses, and to maintain a patriarchal, heteronormative status quo. To pursue this ideal, I will delve into details of genetics and developmental biology of sex that pose real stakes for society at large. The goal will be to investigate phenomena and identify new commonalities that would be difficult to achieve without interdisciplinary conversations and substantial give and take between biology and queer feminist studies. As a lifelong ornithologist, I have focused my own scientific research and writing on issues in avian biology and evolution that lie far from the question of human gender and sex. You may rightly wonder how a bird-watching evolutionary biologist ends up writing a book about queer scientific perspectives on human gender and sex. What expertise can I bring to those well-studied issues? I have no prior formal education in feminist theory or developmental genetics, which are, of course, vast, diverse, and rich fields populated by many dedicated, creative, and influential scholars. Nor do I have the lived experience of a sexual minority that would otherwise inform my views on these topics. What can I, pale, male, and Yale, bring to the discussion of these profound questions of sex and gender? Well, this book, which I think you got an idea is far-reaching. I could describe it as a queer theory of the genotype-phenotype relationship, a critique of gene-centered causation in biology, a material philosophy of sexual difference, that is, variation in reproductive anatomy in the absence of binary sex categories, or as a proposal to create an explicitly queer space in the heart, in the intellectual heart of evolutionary and developmental biology and genetics. But rather than cover that topic as a whole, what I want to do today is try to step away, a little bit away from my personal professorial tradition of the blistering PowerPoint, to give you a sketch of what the direction of the book is, some ways of thinking about the topic, and I hope invitation to questions and to dive into the topic. So how did I come to write this book? Well, rather gradually and then all at once. I'd have to say that the whole exploration of going from ornithology into queer theory started with my last book, The Evolution of Beauty. In The Evolution of Beauty, beginning with a classic topic in reproductive biology of ducks and duck sex, we made the surprising discovery that freedom of choice matters to animals. That is, that there's something that it is like to have freedom of choice, and that there are evolutionary and behavioral consequences for when it's infringed by sexual violence and coercion. And in The Evolution of Beauty, I stated that that was a feminist discovery in science. And for myself, I wondered, why am I so certain of that? Why is this sort of gut reaction or statement seemed so certain. And in fact, it turns out that I really didn't have a broader basis for supporting that. So that led me to become interested in the idea of what would feminist science be like, and in what ways could I support that idea of ornithology as a feminist science in a better way. And with some advice from lots of people, I ended up starting reading more broadly in feminist science studies and queer theory, and ultimately areas of gender theory. Now, initially, there was some shock and maybe even offense. A lot of these authors were really pissed off. But I actually realized that so am I a lot of the time, at the state of the way science often goes. And so we shared that. And yet, one thing I saw that was perhaps missing in a lot of the science critique was an effort to fix the science rather than critique it from outside. And so I found that there was maybe a special opportunity. And then it was through particularly through encounter with particular authors, as I'll talk about, Judith Butler in particular, and performative gender theory, Karen Murad, physicist and feminist philosopher of science, that really led me to pursue a new direction in research that became this book. Of course, the book is well, one way to describe it is not as interdisciplinary, but as undisciplined, right? And what I mean by that is we go wherever we need to go in order to support the series of thoughts and the direction, intellectual direction necessary for the time. And that's both exciting and stimulating, but of course it leads directly to politics. And one of the interesting things about it was the sort of understanding an engagement with politics as a scientific responsibility. And of course, more than ever, the issue of gender sex is interacting with political movements to create really frightening and dangerous harm to sexual minority communities, which is I think a responsibility of scientists to address. And of course, to those who, many of including myself, who were raised in a science culture where we were essentially taught or instructed to stand outside of the culture, looking down and advising in some detached way, I would ask, how's that working for you? And the answer is, I think science has never been under greater attack in our culture and in the world in its several hundred years of history. And so I think that there's certainly a new space and a responsibility. Another big motivation for the book was to understand through the exposure to my own children and to the students I teach at Yale University that there is a growing gap between people's lived experience of gender sex diversity and what science continues to sort of ploddingly say and think and teach about sex. And so I think it's vitally important for us to both reckon with the history of harms that science has been involved with and to try to address that through creative re-envisioning of what science can do and say. Now, originally I wanted to write a short book. I failed. And I imagined a slim manifesto, right? A kind of elegant intervention. And of course that would take less time and be easier. And I also thought what I wanted was a slim book, so small that you could slip it in your back pocket. A book that you could steal easily. Just think, steal this book, from Abby Hoffman. But really, and I also had almost immediately the idea of a book that you could steal off the table in a common room of a dorm room down the hall from yours, because you weren't sure that you wanted anybody to know that you'd found the topic fascinating and interesting, right? But but I found out rapidly that it was very difficult to talk about these, the topic of sex in and biology and culture in a rapid way, and that it really would take more time and more space to unpack. And so ultimately it ended up being a book that you cannot cram in your back pocket very easily. So how can I connect? I'm going to start with what I think is the most efficient way to connect genetics and genomics to queer theory. And actually, this is something that is even more, even new since the book. But I mean, at least this little sketch of an argument. But I want to start with the idea of the genome as a blueprint, right? It turns out I've tracked down what I think is the very first citation of the idea of genes, or the aggregate genes of the body in the genome, in the cells of all of, or in the nucleus of all of our cells, as a blueprint. It comes from 1955, prior to the actual discovery of the codons, or the actual way in which codons, 3 base pairs of DNA, lead to the specification of a certain amino acid within a protein. So this is very early on. And then actually, just 3 or 4 months ago, when the NIH announced their new human pangenome, an attempt to describe the human genome in the maximum diversity, taking into account all global diversity in humans, the NIH director of genomics, human genomics, described it as an effort to reach the ultimate and complete human blueprint. Right? So this is over 60 years the blueprint idea has been with it. And if we examine what that is, if the genome is a blueprint or an algorithm, then the material body is a representation, a material representation of a prior plan, an existence, or evolved encoded within the genome. We can go to philosopher of language, J.L. Austin, to see this as a kind of representational analogy for the genome. The encoded information is represented in the material world. And Austin, back in the 60s and 70s, described these, what he called representational speech acts, like my water glass is on the podium. Right? That's an effort to describe the world in language. Now, Austin contrasted representational speech acts with what he called performative speech acts, the idea of language as an action. So imagine the statement, "I bet you it's going to snow tonight," or "I promise you," ... or the wedding vow, "I do." These are all statements that actually are doing in the world, not representing the world or trying to represent the world, but to do something in the social world. They are speech acts or forms of communication that perform an action. And this is the origin of the word performative, which will be central to my idea today. Performative, of course, has become a very popular concept or popular word in the culture, meaning kind of faux, woke, just for show, etc. But as you can see, when your title is performance all the way down, that means there's nothing else but performance. So it can't mean falseness or just for show. And that's so performativity or performative refers to communication that is an action in the world. And so there is no bigger place where performativity has been studied in greater detail than in queer theory. And queer theory is that branch of philosophy, literary and cultural critique, that examines and investigates the consequences and responses to gender, sex diversity in the world, right? And it's through my engagement with that literature that led me to this project. So it turns out that when I first started this book, I imagined it as as an article, maybe even a short article, maybe even an op-ed. And I had to write a whole book in order to learn how to do that in 3 minutes, right? I learned a thing or two. So let's get into this branch of queer theory that has been so influential to me. In particular, the writers that certainly influenced me the most to begin with were Judith Butler in Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter, and many of her other articles, and then later Karen Barad, a philosopher and physicist at Santa Cruz, whose work in performative science and physics were incredibly influential. Now, what was Butler initially getting at? Well, in response to an earlier concept of gender as a construction, as something that is imposed and created, Butler saw this historic idea as insufficiently taking into account the individuality of people, the fact that people were agents, that they brought things, that many people were absolutely comfortable with the gender alternatives that they were exposed to, and others had a lot of friction and difference. That is, that there's something constitutionally brought to this. And so Butler described a new concept of gender as a performative social phenomenon, right? As a series of both performative in both the sense of a series of actions taking place in a social context, and performative in the sense of an expression that is a doing in the social world. And so these two aspects of performance go down into the heart of this theory. And of course, Butler was incredibly influential. This work has been cited literally thousands of times, but among the many areas that were most influential to me was the work of Karen Barad, who worked specifically in the concept of applying performativity to the study of science, to our interaction, or as she would say, interaction with the material world. So in many ways, the book is in, for those who are familiar with these authors, in this space between, the biological space between Butler and Barad. Now, in my analysis of this literature, I have identified a number of things here which become elements of performativity and performative gender theory that are core to these arguments. And they include the idea of, for example, of discourse. And discourse in the humanities is a structured social set of communications, implying not just communication, but the limitations, restrictions on the audience, on the appropriate means of communication, on who can listen, who is recognized as an appropriate speaker or appropriate audience. Structured communication, the idea of gender as developing through a social discourse with other individuals, both through examples, through feedback, both positive or negative, et cetera. Another aspect of performativity is the idea of agency, that each individual brings not complete freedom, but some constitutional constitutive materials to this engagement, right? And that they have, some aspects of freedom to pursue those. A more academical topic was the idea of citationality or citation. And this is kind of the relation between gender realizations that are influencing one another. It's the idea of the influence of other examples of gender on one's own development, where they could be, certain gender expressions could be described as citations in that way, drawing from literary theory. And of course, the idea of anti-essentialism is, as Eve Sedgwick and others have said, performativity is anti-essentialist. Once you recognize that language can act in the world, then you realize that the language cannot itself be, or that discourse cannot itself be representing some internal or prior essence or inherent essential fact, right? And therefore, performativity is fundamentally anti-essentialist. And then both as a political description of patriarchy and as a description of the possibility for change, performativity, it provides us a theory of both a constraint and innovation in gender. So explanations for why gender can be so restricted into certain circumstances, and the mechanisms by which innovation and change in gender diversity can be achieved in the real world. So it is both an account of patriarchal oppression and an account of the way in which societies and cultures can achieve greater freedom and the capacity to thrive. And then lastly, one of the interesting features that performativity is drawn on is a concept of distributed power, which originally comes from philosopher Michel Foucault in the 60s and 70s. And Foucault, very much against the grain of the times, proposed that power was not hierarchical, coming from the top down, as in the man or whoever, toward each, but that power is distributed at a whole set of loci or in the social network, and in particular the way in which individuals reinforce or control themselves, their own expression, right? That we are self-regulatory, and this idea of distributed power leads to lots of interesting biology. But perhaps the most profound statement in this literature for me as a biologist was, from the following statement from Bodies That Matter by Butler. In reviewing, early on in the book, reviewing the concept of performativity, Butler wrote, "Performativity is the reiterative power of discourse to produce the phenomena that it regulates and constrains." This is really about reiterative, meaning each generation develops, it becomes gendered, achieves gender and over and over and over again, and that discourse, the social communication that's involved, both regulates and constrains what can be achieved. And fascinatingly, at the time when I finally got to the point I realized, there probably is not a more succinct description of genetic regulation that's ever been written. And it really is done entirely in the absence of the idea of genetics. And so the parallels between this work and gene theory or genetics is not remote. So here, in parallel, we'll talk about these same topics in the context of biology. What is discourse in biology? Well, since the last, starting with Spemann and Mangold for biologists out there, transporting pieces of developing tadpole and eggs, frog eggs, to create organisms with multiple nervous systems, different heads in different places, and then later through the work of Jannie Nusslein-Vollard and others, and then a whole huge area within molecular biology, we've learned that the way in which cells become different, that is, the trillions of cells in our body develop and use the same genome to achieve their different morphologies and physiological properties, is through discourse, through molecular communications. And this is just a diagram of Wnt signaling, one particular molecule. This is a kind of paracrine signal. Paracrine signals are molecules released by one cell that interact and affect other cells. And in this case, this is Wnt, this protein, which has been released by this cell. It diffuses into the nearby environment. This cell over here is not expressing frizzled, the molecule for its receptor, but if this cell is, then Wnt can bind to frizzled and create a whole series of cascade of interactions that lead to the changes in gene expression. So the body is entirely achieved both developmentally and physiologically through molecular discourse. And all you have to do is listen for 2 or 3 minutes to any story about biomedicine with the latest new drug, whether it's Ozempic or the classic drugs, whether they're SSRIs. However, these are all discourse modulators, things that have physiological pharmaceutical effect through the way in which they affect the dialogue, the discourse among cells. And of course, agency, another feature of the cell is that this cell is below, oh, just burned out. The cell below is expressing the receptor for the signal, but the one above is not. And that means that these cells actually have a role in whether or not they are listening to other signals, right? Whether they are not, they're playing this game. And that is at least part of this detailed agency of the cell. Right? Now, people are sometimes a little freaked out at the idea of agency, but you can see amoeba swimming around searching for prey items, individual cells. Our bodies are made of trillions of cells, and just because we're part of a single organism doesn't mean those trillions of cells have given up their agency. Right? In addition, we are used to seeing the idea of the selfish gene. What is the idea of the selfish gene? A recognition of the, if not the recognition of the agency of genes, the agency of genes to enact or to pursue their ends, right? And so if genes can be described as selfish, then certainly there are other things that have agency. Molecules, like all those molecules in this network that are acting in a discourse, achieving the ends of the cell. So in addition, citationality can be described as homology. For those of you who have heard of this is the similarity between my forearm and the wing of a bird and the flipper of a whale, right? That is a form of related to the idea of the relation between iterative realizations of a common or similar anatomy. And then, of course, anti-essentialism. Again, if the body is a performance of the self, then indeed, then that implies that, and gene action is a performative discourse. That means that the way in which the body is achieved is not the realization of any internal or prior essence, but a unique and individualized achievement. Constraint and innovation are two of the most fundamental issues in evolutionary biology. And my own work is focused for years on the origin of feathers, a huge innovation in evolutionary history. And so I've been focusing on this topic for a long time. But again, how new morphologies are achieved is also, and how they are prevented is another commonality. And then lastly, power. We're used to imagining the well-regulated body, the homeostatic body. If you get too warm, you start to sweat, and then you lower, that leads to lower temperatures. Or if you're too cold, you start to shiver, and that will raise your body temperature. The way in which we restore some central set point within ourselves. And we see that as sort of an achievement of the body. But in fact, as in Foucault's concept of distributed power, no cells are in charge of the body. Your heart is totally dependent on your kidneys and your brain and your muscles and your bones to help support your active engagement, your thriving as an organism, right? But nobody's in charge of them, right? How does that all work? Well, there is kind of distributed power. And as Foucault wrote, one of the interesting things about distributed power is that it's authorless yet obvious. And that's certainly an adequate, an apt description of the body. Right? And when Foucault also wrote that resistance to power happens in the same way, but at individual loci within the social network. It isn't a special kind of feature. And indeed, once we realize that, apply this to the body, we can see that diseases like cancer are a consequence of resistance to distributed regulatory power. right? And that they use the same vocabulary, the same instruments of power, right? So this idea of Foucault's idea of distributed power has real detailed conceptual applications to the material body. Now, as Cedric and others have written, performativity is really anti-essentialist. So this notion of the body as the performance of the self, the genome as a series of if you will, discursive or lexical material information that is used by the organism in achieving itself, not as the cause of the organism, but as resources used by cell and the organism as a whole in its achievement, right? As I mentioned, I felt like I could have written this book about feathers or flowers or eyeballs, but I just thought that genitalia were a lot more central to the topic. And so it turns out that a large portion of the book is about the development of human sexual bodies, and in particular, the molecular processes. And you can't write a book with the title called Performance All the Way Down without going all the way down. So there's a lot of material supported from the genome, from molecular biology to do this, not just individual demonstrative examples, but a rich review of the way in which performative concepts accommodate that. Today, I just want to mention a few brief things of this idea. One of them is early on in mammalian gonad development, especially including humans, the embryo starts with what has been referred to as a bipotent gonad, a gonad that is already established as a reproductive cells, but is yet to be determined or developed as any particular kind of reproductive capacity or cellular capacity. And then through a series of events, and here we have a description from a classical genetic network of genes that are interacting, as I would say, with other genes, things that upregulate and downregulate each other. And one thing I want to point out is that in the a series of genes that lead to others shown in arrows, and then in the dashed lines, these are interference, or what we call inhibitory messages, right? Now, one of the classic descriptions in the scientific literature is that male development is active. In particular, the pathway to the testis begins with SRY up there in the on the right-hand side, most of the way up. SRY is a gene that is found on the Y chromosome and is often active in the initiation of testis development. But you can see, and so the idea was that SRY, it's actually called the sex-determining region on the Y. And this comes from the idea that testis development was an assertion of sexual determination, right? But that the pathway to ovary development was essentially a passive default. What we can see here in this network is that there's lots of ways in which the development of ovaries suppress the development of the testis. That is, that it is not a passive default, but actually an active assertion. And this changes the dynamic in how that literature goes. In particular, SRY has been described as the master switch of mammalian and human sexual development in literally hundreds of papers. And yet, I won't go through all of this, but to say each one of these activities in human and placental mammals of SRY, from its transcription and translation in the upper right to its movement into the nucleus, to its binding in the lower left, binding to the DNA to upregulate a certain gene, are all subject to accidental and variations, leading to a wide variety of outcomes. And so, indeed, since we are performance all the way down, would this, a performative review of this literature really documents that SRY is not the master of anything, that its action is always contingent on other things that are antecedent to it, various agents that aid in its movement, and subsequent agents downstream from its main job to turn on the gene SOX9. And so this detail is discussed in the book for those who like it. Now, in Bodies That Matter, Judith Butler, who had taken what is generally considered to be the most high cultural perspective on this topic, Butler actually wrote, "Is there a way to link the question of materiality of the body to the performativity of gender?" And indeed, this primary motivation in Butler's work was yet unrealized. And so what I am really hoping to achieve is a new kind of connection between this historical work and the modern genetics development and evolutionary biology. Now, in wrapping up, what I want to do is examine the stakes that are involved. Now, what can be achieved with this work? What's at stake? Well, one of the things that's at stake is to renew in this promise that Butler proposed, right? To create a common intellectual framework for the examination of and investigation of the material body and social and gender and personality and psychology, to rearrange this area with a common vocabulary. But there is lots of others direct implications. Without attempting to speak for trans people and trans experience, one of the primary lessons of this perspective is that if individual sex is a becoming, is a performative realization, then that there is no essential fact of individual sex to be transgressed or to be achieved through trans experience. At the same time, similarly and relatedly, there is no authentic, special, specific experience to be defended through cisgender experience, right? And so this speaks to core topics in the debate. And so I think this anti-essentialist view of individual sex has real important implications. Now, on the science side, we scientists are not used to asking typically, what is at stake? We usually just assume that our work, whether it's on, the song of birds in South America or curing cancer, is just worth it, right? But in this case, there's a lot at stake. And I think one of the things at stake is for us to really, as scientists, to really attempt to reckon with the history of harms and potential future harms and the silence of science in the face of those harms, to take that into account in our science. Another is to try to creatively bridge the gap between historically the two cultures, right? And here's a statement from Donna Haraway in a fantastic paper, Situated Knowledges, where Haraway proposes that translation, convertibility, mobility of meanings, and universality become reductive only when one language, guess whose, must be enforced as the standard of all translations and conversations. So Haraway's view was that the science-humanities interface is damaged when science is always, when the science vocabulary, when science concepts always dominate, always colonize, always reduce. And in this case, I'm very consciously trying to import the language of the humanities into the sciences, to teach scientists that we have a lot to learn about science from people who are not scientists, right? And that queer theory is a fundamental discovery about becoming that the sciences have prevented from discovering through their application of controlled experiments and other reductive concepts. So what I think is really important about this work is that it is a proposal to open up an intellectually queer space in the heart of biology at this core question of the relationship between genes and the body, genes and psychology, genes and material body. I think this can potentially realign not only biology, but those sciences and social sciences that are built upon it, including psychology, including medicine, including economics and sociology that rely so frequently on previously reductive concepts in biology. The idea that biology can recognize and undermine all essentialisms, not just the individual sexual binary, but race and other kinds of essential characterizations is really a great opportunity. And so with that description of my vision for the book, I'm eager to answer any questions and talk as long as you guys want. Thank you very much. Questions up here, and lights are coming up. That's great.
So I was wondering how this topic has informed your teaching and actually changed what you're teaching your students.
Yeah, I teach, well, first I'll say, I'm only beginning this journey, right? There are multiple points at which during the writing of this book, that I scared myself, right? And I figure at my stage, if my work is scaring me, then I feel that I'm doing the right thing, right? So, but I find that my students are much more in line with this than they're not scared, right? And I think that's a good thing. So this is a book for young people. This is a book, and people who want to understand young people, right? Because they're going to be changing the world. But yes, I teach introductory ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale, and just before that, literally days before my lectures, the same students have heard lectures about sexual development in which SRY is called the master switch, and female development is referred to as a default, and this is in the PowerPoints they just had. And so I really try to blow that up. I've got a lot more ammo now. I teach it every other year, and every other year the volume's getting louder. And they love it. I mean, I think they're so used to being, especially in the sciences, being taught, okay, learn this stuff. No, you're not ready to have any opinion. Now learn this, right? That when they see that science has a potential to change, there are questions, fundamental questions that are being addressed, and that data are actually relevant to, and that the way they think it matters. They get really interested, and so I really enjoy bringing this. But as I say, I'm just starting. I really think that the students will soon be teaching me, as they already do, what this all means, right? And that's really, this is a call to change science, which is not easy, but science changes one retirement and one death at a time, and the recruits coming in, if you can get them, then you can really, I think, change the way things happen. So yeah, I'm enjoying it, and also in medicine as well, in evolutionary medicine, other lectures. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was pretty wonderful. I've been following this journey, just starting as well, but the fact that traits in organisms, like the color of the plumage of birds, have been made binary, and now that we're recognizing that those which we believe were binary and linked to sex, now in some cases are not so linked to sex, and we're finding surprises. So I was wondering if that, in your exploration, you have found cases along those lines as well, and if you would
Yeah, and this speaks to the biological productivity of the idea of sexual difference, which is, in the title. We're very used to the science of sex difference, the difference between male and female, where male and female are just, piled up within and recognized as distinct. And yet, sexual difference refers to the idea of variation in the absence of binary categories, right? And this certainly is very productive in anatomically, but as you know, in some birds, it's been recently discovered in hummingbirds, for example, that many species, which have been thought to be sexually dimorphic, with males being bright and females being dull, there's a large portion, 30%, 40% potentially, of female birds that have the brilliant colors of the male. And this is usually described as sexual mimicry. But I'm like, well, who gets to say nobody owns the blue head and the bright green plumage, right? And so that's a case where we're really, I think, searching for new vocabulary, right? Women who wear blue jeans are not mimicking males who were prior wearing blue jeans, right? And so there's lots of ways in which this concept is just inappropriate to biology, and yet there it is, right? And so I think we're just beginning to figure that out.
Yeah, hi. I'm a non-binary person, and I'm really curious about what you would say, how being non-binary, it seems to me, actually really supports what you're trying to say, that the binary is not essential.
Indeed, actually. Yes, if the body is a performance of the self, is achieved, realized in social discourse, that is all the many cells in the body, and then also in social discourse through the series of gender development processes that Butler and many others have outlined. That means that there is no individual essence, that the genome does not have a sex, that chromosomes do not have a sex, that hormone levels do not by themselves define a sex, and that even bodies don't have a sex other than their achieved reproductive capacities. So performative concept of embodiment undermines all these biological essentialisms. Now, and so I would say absolutely that that sex is not a fact about individual zygote, individual genes, individual chromosomes, or organisms. And yet that observation has to accord with the scientific observation that going back at least 500 million years to the common ancestor that we mammals shared with starfishes, there have been all the individuals in our evolutionary history are the result of a sperm uniting with an egg that are created by bodies that are specialized for the production of one or the other. And that for at least 90 million years in our history as placental mammals, that is egg and sperm gestated in a womb. And so only certain kinds of bodies can facilitate or afford those reproductive modes. So there is something deeply binary about evolutionary history and about history. And in the book, I go into detail about essentially a historical ontology of sex. And this difference or this subtlety between the absence of an individual sexual binary and our history of sexual reproduction is subtle, and is going to continue to, or I feel certain it'll be misread or misrepresented, but I think it's an important one. And what's interesting is that 500 million years of sexual reproduction, in and of itself, no matter how vital it is to the creation of lives, cannot create a fact about individuals or a zygote or an intention, right? And that every individual is a performance. And that actually, we go on to say that differences in sexual development, which I describe and analyze and talk about quite a bit in the book, are not evidence of essential sexual binary gone wrong, as biomedicine frequently treats them, but actually are evidence that there is no individual sexual binary, that everybody is making it up for themselves in the world. And I think that is actually scientifically the productive path to go. So I have hopes that biomedicine in particular, sort of, at least some corners, are ready to hear this. I noticed when I got here earlier, Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Song of the Cell, a hardcore molecular developmental cancer biologist talking about the body. And what is a song but a performance, right? A communicative performance, a discourse through performance, right? And so, lots of corners of biology are looking for a new way of thinking about the body and individuality. And I'm hoping that, really that this intellectually queer space in the core of biology will invite new scientists, queer, non-binary, and trans, and their allies, to pursue the science in a way that realizes and is connected to their individuality, right? And I think this is happening all over in the arts, and it's celebrated in the arts, and I look forward to the day of turning to the Science Times on Tuesday section and seeing similar portraits of queer, non-binary scientists talking about their work as an aspect of their lives in ways that's both cutting edge, productive, and indicative of where the future is. And so, of course, this is going to be created by others, and that's what I hope the book is an invitation to that work. Thank you.
Sorry, this might be a little bit dumb, but on the anti-essentialism point that you made, how far does it go? I'm thinking, like, for example, some genes have some predisposition for certain traits. They have a little bit of a degree of freedom, but they are oriented towards achieving something, or the other environment, whatever, forces them to go in certain direction. So, like, for example, I'm thinking like skin color or stuff like that. It's not like they have complete freedom on kind of the range that they do. So,
Sure. Well, one of the things that helps us identify agency, right? In humans, we think, or philosophy, you think of agency as the capacity to make a decision that's contingent, usually contingent on a mental state, like your intention, right? And so that's the kind of high-level, psychological and human agency. And of course, there's plenty of scientists that actually argue that we don't have that either. But what I'm arguing is that cells, for example, have agency in the sense that that is contingent on the history of selection, the history of natural and sexual selection, and that's, of course, the source of the agency, the selfish agency of the selfish gene, right? And I'm arguing that there are other such things. So, of course, yes, the body's performance is under selection. Historically, right? And we know that different skin colors lead to different survival rates in different climates, with vitamin D storage and procuring being important at high latitudes, and protection from skin cancer, and perhaps folic acid preservation at equatorial latitudes with lots more sun. So this history is going to give rise to the capacity to achieve certain phenotypes. But I'm moving very much away from the idea of genes themselves as the causes. And of course, one of the ways we support that idea, the genes causing the phenotype, is by doing controlled experiments where we eliminate all the genetic variation and then expose, well, of course, in that context, this looks like a cause. Actually, the experiment only works when it creates the opportunity for causality, right, which does not exist in the real world. In the real world, of course, all other genes are also potentially variable. And if you look in the newspapers, you'll see, a new report of, they found a new gene for schizophrenia. And what's fascinating, and it's blisteringly significant, right? They got lots of data to support it, and yet it's absent from the vast majority of people that have schizophrenia, and it's vast majority of people that have it don't have schizophrenia. So it's like, what's going on, right? It's like, well, and this is success. This is like, wow, they get another NIH grant to do this again, right? And it's not like that story is totally wrong. What's wrong is the idea that those genes are causes. The way in which those genes have a role is through interactions with numerous other genes within the body. Of course, geneticists know this, and yet they still, for the most part, because studying individual genes leads to individual drugs which intervene with those genes, and leading to funding that can support that work, and also important progress in human health. But yes, the agency that I'm referring to is a product of this history of selection, and I think that's where it arises. Questions online or out there? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to signing some books if you need. Thank you.